You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you, in a dry and parched land where there is no water. I have seen you in the sanctuary, and behold your power and your glory. Because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. I will be fully satisfied as with the richest of foods. With singing lips my mouth will praise you.
Well, kia ora everyone. It is cool to be here as we kick off this brand new series for 4 weeks called Come Away. And many of you won't know Nathaniel, who does all the graphic design work for our church, but doesn't he do an amazing job? For each of these, I think he deserves a round of applause. For each of these 4 messages in the series, he's produced these awesome looking posters, kind of like the old travel kind of look, and this invitation for us to come away. And we're deliberately putting this particular just small 4-week series into this moment in our year because I don't know about you, but this feels the time of year when you start to get a bit weary. You know, we're eight months through the year, but that still means there's 4 months to go till summer holidays. And we've just come through the bleak winter season, which is, I think, the worst season of all. You know, and so we've survived to this point, but here we are, and there's still 4 months till summer, and it's a pretty tough time, I think, when many of us are feeling pretty tired and pretty haggard. And it is no coincidence that in the last 10 days or so, an email pops up in my email box from Air New Zealand advertising the Pacific Islands. Because they know this is the time when the thought of paying some serious money and getting over to a beach in Fiji or Samoa is kind of like the thing that you would love to do, isn't it? And so we want to take this 4-week series to consider a beautiful invitation of Jesus. Hey, come away. Come away. The invitation actually comes from, I don't know if you can see that, but it comes from Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 31. Jesus' ministry is increasing, his popularity is growing, the crowds are flocking to see him. He has just sent his 12 apostles out to do ministry in pairs, and they are coming back and they are full of excitement about what has happened as they have shared the message of the kingdom as Jesus has taught them to do. Opposition is growing, and in the middle of all that is happening, Jesus is now grieving because he has just heard in the middle of all of this the news that his cousin John the Baptizer has just been executed by King Herod. It is all on. And then as his apostles come back, here's what we read in the Gospel of Mark chapter 6 verse 30. It says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. And then because so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat, imagine that, they're so flat out, Jesus said to them, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. Isn't that just a staggeringly beautiful invitation? Come away with me by yourselves to a quiet place and let's just rest. And that in a sense is what this 4-week series is. It's an invitation to just come away with Jesus, to just slow down in this moment of the year when we often can feel quite weary, to just come away. And for each of these 4 messages in this series, we're being invited to come away to a particular place. So this first one for us is a place to refresh. Come away to a place where we can just refresh our souls. And we're going to do that by jumping back into the Old Testament. I loved Hannah's comment that the kids have been stuck in the Gospels and they're finally being freed into the Old Testament. Well, we're going to jump into the Old Testament today as well, to the ancient songbook of Israel, the Psalms. And I want to look with you at a stunning psalm, Psalm 63. So the words as we go through the psalm will not be on the screen, but if you want to have it open in front of you in a Bible or on your app, on your phone, then I welcome you to do that. Psalm 63. Try and say that properly. When I think of a place to refresh, I think of driving north every summer. Rochelle and I jump in the car full of everything, no kids anymore because they drive themselves, but it's still a loaded car, and we head up north up this brilliant motorway that gets us all the way to Warkworth these days before it goes back down to one lane each way. And then we wind up the Brynderwen Hills. Hopefully the road is open and isn't closed by a slip. And we get to the top of the Brynderwens. And as we come over the peak of the Brynderwens, there is this beautiful tapestry of Northland in front of us. There's the Whangarei Heads just in front with a beautiful harbour. There's this picturesque farmland down beneath the Brynderwen Hills themselves. And then there is this stunning coastline, this beautiful long beach that begins up near the refinery, but it comes down through Ruakaka and ends in the destination where we're heading called Waipu Cove. And every year we go to this place to refresh, Waipu Cove, where for 10 days we will enjoy the simplicity of tenting. For 10 days we will eat gorgeous barbecue food every day. For 10 days, Rochelle and I will take our morning coffee and go and sit up on our seat. It doesn't have a name on it, but it's ours. And we sit up on our seat and we look out across the still waters of the cove. For 10 days, we'll walk the beach, we'll play sport, we'll read books, we'll jump into the water and cool off. And it's our place to refresh. And each year, as we head up the Brynderwens and as we drive over the peak, Rochelle and I do the same thing virtually at the same moment. We do this. Because we're about 20 minutes from Waipu Cove. We're almost at this place to refresh. And there's just this deep-seated, satisfied sigh. For centuries, that has been the response as God's people have read Psalm 63. There's something beautiful in these words that invites us to just sigh deeply, because God in these words offers us a place to refresh. It's an invitation to find our refreshment in God alone. This stunning psalm all builds off the opening verse. Verse 1 is the key and the heart to everything that David is going to say in this beautiful song. Here's what verse 1 reads like. You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. This opening verse is both a statement of confidence and a statement of need at the same time. So David begins with this incredible statement of confidence in that opening line. You, God, are my God. It's an incredible statement that opens of faith and trust in God. But then it's immediately followed by this statement of incredible need. I seek you. I thirst for you. I strive for you. I want you. And that's because David's life is in turmoil as he's writing this psalm. His life has fallen apart, and so he uses this powerful imagery through this psalm of feeling like he's in a desert, in a wilderness, and he's got this deep thirst for God because of the experience of where he is at right at this moment. And that's actually literally true for him. Some of the Psalms, not all of them, but some of them will have a little heading at the top, and Psalm 63 does. Here's what it says. Psalm 63, a psalm of David when he was in the desert of Judah. Now, the desert of Judah is an area in Israel to the south of the city of Jerusalem and a little way to the west, a kind of getting away from the Mediterranean and all around the area known as the Dead Sea. And all of the land of Israel, in some sense, is arid and dry, but the desert of Judah is a full-on desert wilderness. It is hot, it is scorching, it is barren, it is a tough place to go. In fact, I think we've got a photo. There it is. That's where David is as he is writing Psalm 63. That is what the desert of Judah looks like. And even today, if you go there, which I would love to do one day, if you go there, you are told that you need to take gallons of water with you, because it is a pretty tough place to be. Now, David had been forced to flee to the desert of Judah twice in his life. The first was as a young man, when he was on the run for his life from King Saul. Saul was the first king of Israel. David had been anointed to become the second king of Israel once Saul had died, and Saul was not happy. And so he began to hunt David, and David becomes a fugitive on the run for his life for years. Possibly a decade of David's life is spent hiding in that place, the desert of Judah on the run. Years later in his life, he will end up back there again. Once he's been king on the throne for a number of years, one of his sons, called Absalom, will lead a coup, and he will seize the throne from his father, and David will go on the run for his life once more, and he ends up back in this same neighborhood again, the desert of Judah. And so Psalm 63 is coming from one of these two episodes, most probably that second one. Because in the last verse, verse 11, David will reference himself as the king. So it's most probably this time period where he's older in life, he's been reigning on the throne for a significant chunk of time, but Absalom has now seized the throne. There's been a coup, a takeover, and David has been forced to run and go hide in the wilderness just as he had done as a young man. And so he uses this description of this place where he is, and he is geographically, he is physically in this wilderness, in what he calls in verse 1 a dry and parched land, literally a waterless and exhausted land. But he uses that as an image for exactly how he's feeling, metaphorically, how he's doing and feeling emotionally in life right now. Following this opening first verse, the key to the whole psalm, there's these three stanzas. And in each of these stanzas, we're given a bit of a hint about how David's really doing in this moment, that he's feeling like he's in the wilderness in terms of his own soul. So in the first stanza, which runs from verses 2 to 5, David describes himself being what I want to call in the desert of difficulty. So he's already described his circumstance in verse 1. He's in a dry and a parched land. But then he says this in verse 2 at the start of the stanza. He says, I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. Now that sounds amazing. That sounds like this beautiful tone of worship here, and it is. He either had a literal vision of the glory of God, or he had this overwhelming sense of awe as he worshiped God in the sanctuary. Now, the sanctuary he's talking about is the tabernacle, which was this portable tent of worship that Israel had used for centuries. But when David had conquered the city of Jerusalem and made it its capital, he had moved the tabernacle there. So the tabernacle, the sanctuary, was now the central place of Israel's life and identity. And David would go there and he would worship God, and he had had the sense of God's power and glory as he worshipped here. But here's what we can't miss. As David says this in verse 2, it's past tense. He says, I have seen you in the sanctuary. In other words, David is reminiscing, he's remembering about a time when he used to just walk out of his palace and down the roads of Jerusalem and walk into the tabernacle and just worship God. And he can't do that anymore. And I want to suggest, I think there's a poignancy here. I think there's a deep sadness here as David reflects how he used to be able to just go and worship in the centerpiece of Israel's worship of God. He used to just be able to go to the tabernacle and meet with God and sense God, and now he can't do that. Now he's on the run for his life. Now he's far away in the deserts of Judah, and he says, I'm in the desert of difficulty because here's where I am right now. I'm in the wilderness, far from the tabernacle, far from God, far from the place of worship. And you know, that's so often how we feel, isn't it? When our lives have turned to custard, we had a dream, we had a hope, we thought this was where our life would be. We imagined this is what life is going to be in this season. This is what it's going to be like. There's where we're hoping to go. This is the dreams we have. And what we find instead is we're stuck over here in the desert of difficulty. We're far away from where we thought we would be. Our lives have turned out different than maybe we had hoped. And maybe the marriage has ended, or the diagnosis has been given, or the accident happened, or bankruptcy was declared, or that child left, or our health crashed, whatever it is, but we find ourselves in the desert of difficulty, far away from how we thought our life would be. And that's how David is feeling as he writes the psalm. But it's not only the desert of difficulty. You come into the second stanza and you get this another suggestion, another hint. David's not only in the desert of difficulty, he is in the wasteland of worry. He's in the wasteland of worry. Because here's what he says at the beginning of the second stanza in verse 6. He says, "On my bed I remember you. I think of you through the watches of the night." You know what's going on here? He can't sleep. He's tossing and turning. He's lying in his tent out in the wilderness. He's gazing up at the canvas. He's thinking about what's going on. He's wondering what Absalom's doing. He's tossing. He can't drift off. He closes his eyes. He turns the other way. He can't get comfortable because he's filled with anxiety and concern and worry about where he's at. Ever experienced that? Some of you are experiencing that now. Last night wasn't a good sleep. Leads me into a secret. Saturday night's never a good sleep for me if I'm preaching on Sunday. But that isn't why David's struggling to sleep. No, he's in the wasteland of worry because life has turned to custard for him. His own son has stolen the throne from him. And he's far away from where he intended to be. And he's so full of anxiety and concern and maybe even fear for the future. He can't sleep. That's not how everyone reads the psalm, by the way. There are scholars who read verse 6 and say, he's having an all-night prayer meeting. He's having a vigil with God, which sounds awesome, but I just don't think that fits the context of where David is. I think he's lying in bed just like you and I do sometimes, fretting and anxious and worried. He's in the desert of difficulty, and he's in the wasteland of worry. And then the third stanza begins this way in verse 9. "Those who want to kill me will be destroyed. They'll go down to the depths of the earth. They'll be given over to the sword and they'll become food for jackals." Sounds like a very vindictive King David at this moment, doesn't it? And so there's a group of liberal scholars who don't believe the Bible's the word of God, who say these aren't even David's words. David finished at the end of verse 8. And then these words, which you notice on the video, we only read to verse 8. Because verses 9 and 10 are pretty heavy, pretty cruel, pretty mean. David didn't write them, liberal scholars say. They got tacked on by someone else. It's like David in the 8 verses painted this beautiful portrait and then someone else came along and graffitied it with these words. But I don't think this is graffiti. I think this is David's heart. Because as he's in the desert of difficulty and the wasteland of worry, David feels betrayed. David feels let down by people that he trusted. David thought that these people had his back, and it turns out they don't. It's his own son that's stolen the throne. How deeply would that have cut into David's soul? His most trusted advisor, a dude called Ahithophel, has chosen to throw his lot in with Absalom. And while some of the people, as David scurried to leave Jerusalem, while some of the people wept, many of the other people flocked to Absalom and declared him to be king and were celebrating this new king because they were sick of stuffy old King David. And David feels betrayed by people. So he's in the desert of difficulty, he's in the wasteland of worry, and he's in the badlands of abandonment. He is in a sorry place, friends. And so David is writing this psalm in a period of tremendous difficulty in his life. So what does he do? Where does he go? And where do we go when we're in the same place? When we are in the desert of difficulty, when our life has turned into something completely different from where we thought we'd be. What do we do when we are in the wasteland of worry, when we can't get to sleep at night because of the concern and the anxiety we feel? What do we do when we feel like we're in the badlands of abandonment and people that we thought we could trust have betrayed us? What do we do? Where do we go? Well, David's already told us where we go and what we do. Come back with me now to verse 1 and let's read verse 1 again. You, God, are my God, and earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. See what David does when he finds himself in the desert of difficulty, in the badlands of abandonment, in the wasteland of worry, is he thirsts after God. He goes running for God. He goes looking for God. He craves after God. Because ultimately the place to refresh is not a place like Waipu Cove, it's a person. The person that our souls were created to long for. And David, in this wilderness moment, this wilderness season in his life, he says, where I found refreshment was in the God who made me, and the God who saves me, and the God who forgives me, and the God who loves me. And that's where we are to go. And so David says powerfully all the way through this psalm, when you and I are in the desert of difficulty, thirst for God. When we find ourselves in the wasteland of worry, tossing and turning at night, thirst for God. When we find ourselves in the badlands of abandonment where we feel betrayed, thirst for God. Go running for God. See, friends, this is the key idea of this whole psalm. Thirst for God. Thirst for God because He is the refreshing oasis of our souls. He is the refreshing oasis of our souls. He's the one who quenches our thirst in a dry and parched land where there is no water. See, the picture David is trying to paint for us is that God is like this stunning oasis. Imagine trekking through the desert, the heat beating down, you're so dry, your tongue is sticking to the roof of your mouth, and then you look up and you see this beautiful oasis before you. And maybe you're so water deprived at that point, you wonder if it's a mirage, but as you get closer, it's not. That's the image that David has. And in the middle of this desert of Judah, there is exactly that. There is a beautiful oasis. There it is. It's called En-Gedi. The oasis of En-Gedi. En-Gedi means the springs of the kid or the springs of the goat. And it's because it seems like wild goats would flood to this. And you can still go to En-Gedi today. It is this beautiful, can we have the photo back up for just a few more minutes, a few more seconds? It's this beautiful oasis in the middle of this desert that has got stunning greenery and wonderful shade, cascading water from these springs that never run out, that quenches your thirst. And people, you can still go to it. There's a million visitors a year go to En-Gedi. And what makes this such a stunning, not only is it a gorgeous oasis, but what makes it so stunning and so amazing, it is in the middle of this desert wasteland we saw before. And what David is trying to help us understand is that that is what God can be in our lives when we feel like we're in the wilderness. When we feel stuck in the desert of difficulty, when our life has turned out to be something far, far away from what we thought it was going to be, God can be the oasis of our souls. When we find ourselves in the wasteland of worry, when we can't go to sleep and we toss and turn at night, David wants us to understand God can be the oasis we're thirsting for. When we find ourselves in the badlands of abandonment, when people have let us down, He wants us to know God will never let us down because He is the oasis of our souls. So He says, thirst for God. Thirst for Him. The truth is, friends, that we can thirst for a whole bunch of other things, though. We can look for other things to quench the thirst of our souls when we're in the wilderness. We can thirst after idols, the idol of pleasure to kind of dull our pain. We can thirst after the idol of financial security, thinking that's what's going to help us feel good through the wilderness experience. We can search for the idol or thirst for the idol of romantic love. We can thirst for the idol of experiences and fun and enjoyment to try and take the pain away. We can thirst for power or control so we feel like we've got this. And even in those hard seasons, we can thirst for relief. We can thirst for answers. We can thirst for help or hope. But ultimately, what will quench our thirst is God and God alone. And that's why David writes this psalm and begins with these words. You, God, are my God. And so earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you, and my whole being longs for you. David is inviting us in this beautiful psalm to thirst for God because He and He alone is the refreshing oasis of our souls. So when you're in the desert of difficulty, thirst for him. If you find yourself in the badlands of abandonment, thirst for him. If you're in the wasteland of worry, thirst for him. So how do you do that? How did David manage to do that in this wilderness experience that he was in? Well, that's what he's showing us in the 3 stanzas, actually, that make up this psalm. So after this incredible invitation in verse 1 to thirst, in each of these stanzas, he shows us what it is that he focuses on and meditates on in order to help him thirst for God in the midst of this wilderness. So in the first stanza, after he's poignantly looked back and remembered what it was like to worship, here's what he says in verses 3 to 5. He says, "Because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. I'll praise you as long as I live. In your name I'll lift up my hands. I'll be fully satisfied with the richest of foods. With singing lips my mouth will praise you." Sounds like he's having a worship time, doesn't he? But now he's not in the tabernacle. Now he's out, in the back blocks of beyond in the wilderness of Judah. And he's turned it into a worship time. How's he done that? We'll go back to the start of that passage we just read in verse 3. Because, he says, your love is better than life. See, David chooses in this moment, in the desert of difficulty, to zero in on the love of God for him. The word love here, in the original Hebrew language that the Old Testament was written in, this is my favorite Hebrew word. You might have heard me speak about this before. It is the word chesed. Chesed. Chesed is the loyal love of God. It's not a romantic-y feeling of love. It is a love that never lets you go. It is the unfailing love of God. And that's what David focuses on here in the desert of difficulty. He chooses to zero in and think about and meditate on this love of God, that even though he's in this desert place, far, far away from where he thought he was going to be at this moment in his life, he is surrounded by and upheld by a love from God that never lets him go. So what David is saying to us is, when we are in the desert of difficulty, thirst for God, because his love will never let us go. And then he comes to the second stanza where he's tossing and turning on his bed in verse 6. And then he says this in the next couple of lines, verses 7 and 8. "Because you are my help, I sing in the shadow of your wings. I cling to you, your right hand upholds me." There's 2 powerful images in these 2 verses. The first, in verse 7, is the image of a mother hen that gathers its young, its chicks, under its wings for shelter and protection. This is an image that is used time and time and time again in the Psalms, that God is like this mother hen that gathers and protects and looks after you and I. Stories are told of situations like forest fires that go ripping through an area. And as people come through afterwards and to clean up the mess, they find the burnt carcass of a mother hen, where the mother hen just sat and allowed itself to be burned to death. And people will just nudge that carcass, move it out of the way with their foot, and all of a sudden, little chicks come out, bounding out, alive and free and protected, because the mother hen gave its life to protect those little chicks. That's the image that David is talking about in verse 7. And then he adds to that in verse 8 by talking about the strong grip of God. He's talking about hands that are clasping, clinging to each other. And he says in verse 8, "I cling to you, God." And that verb he uses is incredibly strong. It's almost like he's saying, I'm super gluing myself to you, God. I'm going to hang on to you in this desert I'm in, this wasteland of worry. I'm going to hang on to you no matter what. But then in the second line he says, and your right hand clings to me. In other words, you know what? Even if I fail, even if I run out of strength and I can't even cling to you anymore, God, I know you've got me. Like a person who's fallen over a cliff and someone reaches down to lift them up. He's saying, God's got me. He's like a mother hen who encompasses me. It's like the grip of a friend who holds on to me. And even if I can't keep clinging, he's never going to let me go. So what David's describing here is the faithfulness of God. And he says, when you are in the desert of difficulty, thirst for God, because his faithfulness never lets us go. His faithfulness continually, surrounds us. And then finally in that third stanza, when David describes the badlands of abandonment, when he's so angry at the people who have betrayed him, here's how he finishes that stanza and the entire psalm in verse 11. He says, "But the king will rejoice in God. All who swear by God will glory in him, while the mouths of liars will be silenced." He ends up turning away from his enemies and those who have betrayed him and those who have hurt him deeply to focus on God, this all-powerful God who will see it through in the end. God's going to win. God's going to have the ultimate victory. God's going to get his people home. And so David says, when you are in the badlands of abandonment, thirst for him, because his all-encompassing power will bring you home, no matter where you are. See, what David is doing in this extraordinary psalm that comes out of one of the toughest periods of his life is he thirsts for God. He recognizes that God himself is the place to refresh. And he invites us to thirst for him right alongside him. Thirst for God, because he is the refreshing oasis of our souls. I don't know where you're at today. I don't know whether my description of this desert of difficulty, this badlands of abandonment, this wasteland of worry, whether one or all of those fit you right now. But I've had this sense on me all week that this is a word for some of you. Whether you're sitting here with us, whether you're watching online, my sense is that God is speaking to some of you very strongly. And he is inviting you in whatever your wilderness is right now to use this season to thirst for him, to come running to him, to lean into him, to trust in him even more than you have. You see, the desert, the wilderness, the badlands can actually be a beautiful gift from God to us. I read these words this week from an author named John Bloom. He says, "This is the blessedness of the barren places, a pain gift of priceless worth, because it drives us, like nothing else, to the only one that will quench our thirst." Let me read that again. This is the blessedness of the barren places, friends. This is a pain gift of priceless worth, because these experiences in our lives, they drive us like nothing else to the only one who can quench our thirst. Friends, his love will never let you go. His faithfulness will continually surround you, and his great power will bring you home. So whether you're in the desert, the wasteland, the badlands, or the wilderness, thirst for him. Come away and find your rest in God alone. We're going to finish our service with a couple of songs that invite us to come running to this God. But then at the end of the service, as we always do, we will have a prayer team available over here. And I think this, if ever there was a Sunday where some of you need to put a hand up and say, "I need prayer," it's this one. So I want to invite you at the end of the service to come and approach the prayer team and allow them to pray for you. I'm going to be sitting over here. I would love the honor of praying with you. Or you may be with people that you know and trust and love. Why don't you just reach out to them and say, "Hey, I'm in the wilderness. I'm in the desert. And I long to be able to thirst more for God in this season. Would you pray for me?" Let's thirst for God in these times, because he's the refreshing oasis of our souls. Lord God, thank you for the beautiful words of the psalm. Thank you for the amazing reminder that as we find ourselves in these wilderness moments when we feel abandoned or full of anxiety and worry, or stuck in places we never thought we'd end up in, we can find you. We can thirst for you. And we can find that you are the one who truly satisfies us in life. Thank you for these stunning words of David when he was in one of his darkest moments, that reach out to us in our dark moments. And so we come, we search, we seek, we thirst for you alone.